Welcome to the episode. I'm Gary Dumbrell, and today we're going to be talking about what is the difference between oppression and just being mean. It's really important for social workers to be able to differentiate someone being mean or an institution having rules they don't like from someone or an institution being oppressive. Mullally tells us that not everything that frustrates, limits, or hurts a person is oppressive. What determines oppression is when a person is blocked from opportunities to self-development, is excluded from full participation in society, does not have certain rights that the dominant group takes for granted, or is assigned second-class citizenship, not because of individual talent, merit, or failure, but because of his, her, or their membership in a particular group or category of people. With this in mind, when social workers use the word oppression to refer to someone's troubles, it's because these troubles result from a pattern of pressing down and holding back that affects an entire group or category of people. So common is this holding down and pushing back certain groups within society that we can actually list some of those groups. Human rights legislation does that. The Ontario Human Rights Code lists age, ancestry, colour, race, citizenship, ethnic origin, place of origin, creed, disability, family status, marital status, gender identity, gender expression, receipt of public assistance, record of offences, sex, sexual orientation, as groups that commonly get pressed down and held back by oppression, and therefore need legislation to ensure that that doesn't occur. This is not an exhaustive list, but it demonstrates a number of groups that are more likely to be on the receiving end of oppression. Now, of course, social work helps anyone trod down or treated unfairly, no matter the cause. But we reserve the term anti-oppressive practice for addressing patterns of treading down that affect entire groups of people. Now, the oppression we're talking about here occurs at three levels: the individual, the cultural, and the systemic. All of these don't have to be happening simultaneously for it to be considered oppression, but all of these are a part of the way oppression operates within society. Individual level oppression is usually personal prejudice. If an employer is prejudiced against women or racialized people and rejects applicants based on their gender and race rather than their ability to undertake the work a job requires, then that is individual level oppression. Cultural oppression is the dominant group using their power to shape the nation's culture around their own ways of being. Examples of that would be Canada's various attempts to ban the hijab or face coverings. It's also cultural meanings at a deeper level. If you look up Benjamin Zephaniah unpacks this in the differences just between the words black and white. Do a search for Benjamin Zephaniah, Zephanih, and the phrase white comedy. Listen to that spoken word and he will unpack that for you. Residential schools is another example of not only oppression at the cultural level, but also an attempt at cultural genocide. It's also an example of systemic oppression because it became a part of the operating system of Canada. It got built into legislation and became a core component in the way Canada was identifying and building itself as a nation. And of course, the legacies of residential schools continue with us today. Another example of systemic oppression is where I live. There's no way to get into the house where I live without climbing steps. It means I can never invite someone who uses a wheelchair over to dinner, and none of my friends can either, because they have steps outside their places too. Even if that person could somehow get into the building, it's not much help, because I have no wheelchair accessible washroom. There is, in fact, a washroom on the ground floor in my house, but it's not wheelchair accessible. It would be simple when the builder made this place to put a wheelchair accessible washroom there. It wouldn't have cost any more if it was a part of the building plan. But we build our homes to exclude people who use wheelchairs and include those who don't. It's an example of systemic oppression that we as a society have allowed to be built into the very bricks and mortar of our policies and institutions, and even in the homes in which we live. To try and pull this together, an oversimplistic but a useful way of defining oppression is to say that oppression is prejudice plus power. Back in the day in the 80s, when I started doing this, we used to say racism is prejudice plus power. We could still say that because really the way I engage with these topics is that race is the entry point to understand oppression. And you'll understand why I say that when you come to the Whiteness and White Supremacy podcast. This saying that oppression or racism is prejudice plus power is critiqued because the word prejudice implies that it's just something at an individual level. But this statement is still useful because if we think of prejudice and add the word bias in, then you have oppression is prejudice and bias that loads the system against certain groups of people at the individual, cultural and systemic levels, plus power. Power is important because you can have a biased individual or group of individuals, a culture and a whole lot of systems, but unless there's power to back those biases up, then all you've got is a whole range of bad attitudes. It's the power part that enables all of those three levels to push specific groups of people down and hold them back. There's another dimension I have to add in there. You may have absolutely no power yourself as an individual, or somebody may have no power, but you can still draw on and perpetuate that system and even sometimes benefit from it as well at the expense of the people who are being pushed down and held back. And the last thing I want to mention before we start to wrap this up is if you're trying to figure out if something's oppressive or just being mean, don't just look at the impact it has on the people who are being oppressed. Look at who's benefiting from that. Oppression is identified by examining not only the way it harms the oppressed, but also the benefits it affords the dominant groups. So every time someone's held back or pushed down, it actually benefits certain groups and people in society. That's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to stop oppression, because there's a whole bunch of people benefiting from holding other groups back. The other thing to look for is the outcomes in social demographic data. This is why it's really important to de-aggregate data, because you can see the footprint of oppression in those data. So I hope those ideas are some help. And that's it from me, and I will see you next time.